Welcome to part 7 of the brain. We're going to kind of throw together some basal nuclei areas that talk about the limbic system and the reticular activating system, and then make a little nod towards brain waves. So I guess we'll add brain waves onto the title. All right, let's get started. All right, the basal nuclei. So remember that these are islands of gray matter, all right, or pockets of gray matter embedded in the white matter of the brain, okay? So you've got the cerebral cortex, which is completely surrounding the outside, and then you've got the basal nuclei, which is also gray matter, but it's tucked in little pockets and spots within the interior white matter of the brain or cerebrum. I guess we should add that. Notice I'm not going to write down everything that's on my note slides that are already in the PowerPoint, so you should be going and looking at that. So we had structures that we're going to be looking at, again, that I've written down on the note slides, so I'm not going to rewrite them here, but you need to know the corpus striatum, caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, and the amygdala, okay? We're eventually going to get to talking about some of the central processing areas that do not access the motor pathways directly. So what's important about the functioning of the basal nuclei? So we're going to have more specific functions later, but let's just talk about some of the general functions or roles of the basal nuclei. So we don't want to have to be thinking about all of the complex, repetitive things that we do all the time. So the basal nuclei take over those things that you need to be able to do without thinking about it. All right, so complex, repetitive movements like writing, shooting a basketball, shoveling dirt, eye movements, using scissors, all of that constant, repetitive things that you can think about if you want to, but most of the time you don't want to think about it. Okay? You can also use the different parts of the basal nuclei to modify voluntary movements. Okay? And that goes along with this whole complex, repetitive, like I could think about what I'm writing here, or I could just not, okay? So because of this, it's going to have connections to a lot of different parts of your brain, the motor association areas, sensory association areas, motor cortex, okay? And because of these connections, it can produce both positive and negative feedback loops. All right, I want you to think back to the different types of parallel processing. Okay. There is a lot about the brain we don't understand very well. That includes a lot of the basal nuclei. So you're going to see a lot of things in here that says may or probably. So may have a role in regulating attention and cognition, which basically means there's some evidence that it does, but we don't really understand how or why, okay? Part of that evidence has to come from when things don't go right. There are certain disorders where the basal nuclei are damaged and we end up getting too much movement or too little movement, but we also see issues with cognition and attention regulation with those disorders. So that's why one of the reasons why they think that this is going on. All right, let's look at some pictures of the basal nuclei. All right, so remember the basal nuclei, islands of gray matter embedded within the white matter. Now we often say they're islands because when we cut them, they look like little islands, but they can be actually much larger structures that are looped within the white matter. So right here is one of the biggest ones, the corpus striatum, which is going to be divided into the caudate nucleus and the putamen, we'll start with putamen, caudate nucleus, and then down here, the scorpion's tail, which is the amygdala. Okay. Here you can also see where they're representing the internal capsule and the corona radiata going away from these areas. Okay, and so those are part of the white matter. But it's a nice picture for seeing both of those. Okay. Now let's look at a transverse section through the brain. All right, so if you look up here, you can see what they've done is they've sliced through the brain and they've lifted the top off. So you're looking down on it over here. What I like about this picture is that one is a drawing with colors on it, and the other is a cadaver. Okay, so that you can see how you get the help of the diagram's coloration while seeing what it really looks like. So here you can see the head of the caudate nucleus. So remember, it's kind of going like right here, where you've got the putamen right here. Okay, so this is putamen, and then you've got the caudate nucleus. So this is the caudate nucleus, and that's going to come around like this, and then you got the little scorpion's tail, which is the amygdala. Okay. But when you do a transverse section, that's not really what you see, all right? You're seeing it basically cut through right about here. So here you can see this part of the caudate nucleus. Here you can see this part of the putamen, okay? So they're showing the basal nuclei done in this fuchsia-like color. And then you can see a little bit of the tail. They're not even showing it over on this one. A little bit of the tail of the caudate nucleus right here. And that's about all you can see with this particular representation. Now, here is the thalamus, okay, which is considered a different structure, but it is also gray matter, okay? All right, let's do some more discussion. Let's talk about some neurotransmitters next. All right. You know, there's so much we can talk about with neurotransmitters, and we're just not going to get into a whole lot of it. So let's just kind of do a really brief intro. With neurotransmitters, you've always got ones that are excitatory versus ones that are inhibitory. But remember, you've also got some types of neurotransmitters that can both inhibit and excite. So we've already looked at a lot of these already. So like GABA, we already know is inhibitory. Acetylcholine is both excitatory and inhibitory. Norepinephrine, excitatory or inhibitory. Serotonin is an example of one that can do either. Okay? And then we've looked at glutamate, and we know that that one is excitatory, and in fact can be an excitotoxin. Okay? Another one that's inhibitory would be dopamine. Okay, so these are some of the neurotransmitters. There are others, but these are the main ones that we're using with the basal nuclei. Okay, now what's interesting is what you can learn about these things when things go wrong. So GABA is associated with Huntington's disease. And basically, when GABA goes down, you basically start to lose its secretion in the basal nuclei, and it's going to be, so basically the GABA goes down, okay? And then without that, you've got neurons that are going to be too active, okay? And then you also are going to lose acetylcholine as neurons that work with that. And what else can I say about Huntington's? It's a genetic disorder. So a mutation causes the neurons to not be making the GABA, okay? The result of losing the GABA and the acetylcholine is that you do not inhibit excess movement. So basically, you get increases of flapping, shaking like movements, because you are no longer inhibiting excess voluntary muscle contractions. Okay, which is interesting to think about. What are we going to talk about next? Next, we want to start getting into the conceptual areas of the brain, okay? Now, what is interesting about conceptual areas, so like a lot of the places that we've already looked at in the body, it's like skeletal muscle does muscle contractions. Skeletal muscle crosses the humerus bone and goes to the radius bone, and then you've got a very predictable response. The brain is more complex, okay? So we've got disparate areas, all right, that are not necessarily connected structurally, okay? So they're not next to each other. They're not linked, but they function to work together for a certain purpose, okay? So we've got these like things spread out all over the place, and then they come together to work on something. The two most famous ones that we're going to talk about are the limbic system, okay, and the reticular activating system. Which from now on, because it's a pain to write all that out, I'm going to abbreviate it as the RAS. Okay? Not the cross, the RAS. Okay? Now, what you want to remember about the limbic system is that this is the emotional side of the brain. Okay? Most of it is going to be related to the forebrain, but there are some exceptions. Okay? And we are going to go over that in a little bit more. The reticular activating system, I want you to focus on that word activating. It is an alert system. Okay? And the bulk of it is going to be located down in the brainstem. Okay? So for now, let's really focus in on the limbic system. Okay? So the emotional side of the brain. So what are the different parts? So what parts are going to work together? Okay? So you got different parts of the cerebrum. So like parts of the cingulate gyrus, the amygdala, hippocampus. Some of these words you may recognize. Hippocampus, etc. There are other parts of the cerebrum that are involved. But, so this would be the cerebrum parts. We are also going to throw in the hypothalamus, which is incredibly important to the limbic system. Okay? And a little bit of the thalamus. So just one little section called the anterior nucleus. I don't actually care if you remember anterior nucleus, but just a tiny section of the thalamus. Okay? And then you need to be able to connect all these things. So how do they talk to each other? They're going to do that with a structure we call the fornix, which is basically a fiber track. All right, where you're going to be connecting up the different areas of the limbic system. So, what is the purpose or function of your limbic system? All right, so it's going to be involved in all of the emotional states and behaviors. Okay, it seems to play a role in bridging your conscious and unconscious mind. Okay. It's also important for playing roles in short-term memory and information storage, especially short-term recognition of like facts, objects, etc. It's also your pleasure or reward center. So this is also called sometimes your gratification center. Now remember, pleasure and pain often go together. So also fear, sorrow. Okay, so both the positive and the negative. So gratification, center for gratification, and the center for aversion. Okay? What's interesting about the limbic system is that it is really the source of what used to be called, or disparagingly called, psychosomatic illness. Okay? It is real. It is not fake illness. Okay? Even though back in the 70s and 80s, it was taught as it's all in your mind and it's not real and you can make it go away. It's actually not that simple. And that is because of the hypothalamus and the fact that the hypothalamus is not only the heart of the limbic and emotional system, it is also the heart of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so ANS, autonomic nervous system. So it controls emotions and all of your guts, organs, non-voluntary stuff. Okay? So if your hypothalamus becomes upset emotionally, all right, it becomes scared or nervous or any of those things, it can start messing with your organs and do things like increase your heart rate in response to memories of fear. Okay? It can increase heartburn by squeezing on your stomach or causing excessive secretions of hydrochloric acid. It can increase your blood pressure. So basically, signals get crossed when your hypothalamus is emotionally upset. Okay? All right, let's look at a few pictures of where some of these structures are located. All right, so there is so much about the brain and the central nervous system that we can learn. And I know I've said this before, but we are simplifying it as much as possible. So you will see me putting what things do. I've narrowed it down to like the minimum functional information that you need to know, okay? So don't try to memorize the entire book. Focus on memorizing the stuff that I have on the PowerPoint slides. So here we've got our limbic system, and you can see the putamen and the cingulate gyrus coming around, caudate nucleus, and then that's going to come around, and then you come over here, we've got part of the hippocampus, we can see part of the amygdala, okay? So these are the areas that are going to be involved with that limbic system, but we've also, you can see it's got connections to the forebrain, okay, to your prefrontal cortex. So there are going to be interconnections with that part of the cerebrum as well, okay? Different areas kind of focus on different things, so like conscious manifestations in the cingulus gyrus. The hippocampus is going to focus on memory. The mammillary body right here, and don't confuse it with mammary, mammillary, there's L's. Olfactory memories, so when you smell lemons, or better yet, you smell chocolate chip cookies baking, you think of your childhood, okay? And so forth. Let's see, what do I have next? I think I have a picture of neurotransmitters next. Let's look at that. So I find the neurotransmitters interesting, and I'm not asking you to memorize this picture, but all I want to do is kind of point out how the neurotransmitters behave differently. So you got dopamine in green, norepinephrine in this orangey color, which actually isn't showing up on here correctly. It's not showing up at all. And then you've got the serotonin right here. So the norepinephrine should be in blue. All right, so change norepinephrine to blue. So you can see that the dopamine is being secreted from the basal nuclei in these areas, and it really stimulates this part of the brain, whereas both serotonin and norepinephrine go to more areas of the brain, which I think it's interesting to think about how neurotransmitters can be very widespread, or they can focus on certain structures, okay? And that is about all we're going to say about that limbic system. So let's go on and talk about the reticular activating system. So first of all, what have you got? So ignore this little red arrow. That was a conversion problem with the PowerPoint. I have no idea why it's showing up. So with this reticular activase, so the reticular formations are going to be loose islands of gray matter. So gray matter, and so these are basically types of basal nuclei, okay? They're going to be running throughout the brainstem. So they're basically going up and down like this. Now, often when we look at things, we do a cross section. And so the reason you see an island is because we've cut through the gray matter that's going up and down, okay? I hope that makes sense. So we squeeze in these islands in between the fiber tracts, okay? And it's going to connect up a bunch of different areas. And it's all of these gray matter areas are composed of lots and lots and lots of interneurons, okay? So if we come over to the picture, what we're going to see is over here is you've got your brainstem, and they're showing in red right here where you've got these concentrations of basal nuclei that we give the special name reticular formations, because these basal nuclei work together as part of the reticular activating system, okay? All right, let's look at the next, let's do some notes before we go on. All right, remember, look at my PowerPoints for the note slides, because I'm not going to rewrite absolutely everything that's on those slides. So in terms of these reticular formations that are going to play a role in building the reticular activating system as well, we've got a number of different functions that they are going to be helping with. So we've got somatic motor control. So this is talking about those voluntary muscle contractions. So again, you don't want to be thinking about every single voluntary muscle contraction you do. You want to do some at a more unconscious level. All right. So all of the muscle contractions that you need for maintaining muscle tone, for maintaining balance and posture, okay, you don't want to think about it. So the reticular formations are going to take over these subconscious voluntary muscle contractions, okay? Now, when we are doing movement, we need information, sensory information about our environment. So we need to basically relay eye and ear info to these motor areas. So we're going to go and relay this to the cerebellum, and then the cerebellum is going to integrate with the brainstem to send out these signals to voluntary muscles to do their thing without you having to think about it. So basically, it's going to integrate sensory information and the information you need to do motor. Okay, so it's integrating the sensory information to modify motor coordination, okay? It also helps with things like eye tracking. We call this the gaze centers. So it helps to get your eyes to track and fixate on certain thingies. Wow, certain objects. All right, and then you've got patterns. So we talked about in the last chapter and a half ago about neural pools. All right, neural pools are going to work together to create rhythmic patterns for things that you don't want to think about, but you need to be constantly doing. So this would be things like breathing and swallowing, okay? So that's just some of the somatic motor controls. It can get you, there's a way more information that you could learn about this, but just try to keep it simple. All right, we also need to regulate cardiovascular functioning. And it's basically, this part of the reticular formations are going to be located down in the medulla oblongata. And they're going to be focusing on not just the heart or cardiac control, but also vasomotor control. So this is basically the dilation and constriction of your blood vessels, okay? What else? We can go on. Pain modulation. So as we talked about in the last chapter with pain signaling, we need to be able to modulate that pain. So it's going to ascend through the reticular formations, but then as it descends, there are parts of the reticular formations that can modulate or block the transmission of pain signals, okay? So pain modulation. We've got the state of being asleep versus conscious or awake. So there are parts of the reticular formations that basically help with sleep, consciousness, and also how alert you are, okay? If you injure the parts of the reticular formations that are doing this, it can result in irreversible coma, okay? And then there's this idea of habituation, okay? If you think about your environment, you might be hearing wind blowing, or your heater is turned on, or you might be having background music. These are all things in your background that you don't want to be paying attention to because they're always there. So it's repetitive, inconsequential things that you don't need to be paying attention to. Both the thalamus and parts of the reticular formations will play a role in basically reducing or completely ignoring that stimuli so that it doesn't take up brain power, okay? All right, let's move on, and I want to look at some pictures along with some notes. All right, so what we've been looking at so far is really going over the reticular formations embedded within the brainstem, okay? Now we want to look more specifically, now that we've got that background information, we want to focus more specifically on the reticular activating system. So these are going to be certain reticular formations that are going to work together, okay, in order to basically keep the brain aroused, alert, conscious. It's going to be doing this habituation filtering, and it's going to help coordinate autonomic and motor functions, okay? So if we look over here at this particular picture, this is a cross-section through the medulla oblongata, and you can see the white matter here, and then you've got these little pockets. These pockets are all types of gray matter, okay? All of this, all of that, that's gray matter. Now, the reticular formations are certain the reticular activating system is going to be certain parts of the reticular formations like these that are going to work together, okay? And then they're all going to connect up to the thalamus and hypothalamus, cerebral cortex and cerebellum, and the spinal cord. So these are all kind of linked up, but it's all these disparate areas, which is why it's considered a conceptual area. All right, let's look at another view of this. So here's another picture where we can see they're highlighting some of the reticular formations right here, and then what they're doing, so this is the transverse cross-section, and then over here they're showing you the vertical. So you've got your ascending tracts in blue, and then surrounding it, they're trying to represent in the pink where you would find these reticular formations, which are these islands of gray matter, okay? Now with the reticular activating system, what you're remembering is it's going to be certain reticular formations working together to keep you alert, conscious, and coordinated. Now, what you will notice is that I'm not making you memorize a bunch of different things about this, about the different areas, or naming these things over here in cross-section. So what you want to remember is that these are reticular formations located in the medulla oblongata that work together, all right, to keep the brain alert, conscious, coordinating some of the autonomic and motor functions, etc., okay? And that they ultimately connect up to the hypothalamus, thalamus, parts of the cortex, and the cerebellum in order to integrate all of this. But reticular activating system is your alert system. All right, let's look at the next slide. All right, in the PowerPoint, you've got a little note slide about integrative functions of the brain. We're going to do some more little lectures where I'll talk about some of these things. So, but the two major conceptual areas that we've talked about were the limbic system and the reticular activating system. That doesn't mean there aren't other areas where you've got integration of multiple parts of the brain working together. So they don't always get special names like reticular activating system and the limbic system. But basically the brain doesn't have like this part does this and that part does that. That's a serious oversimplification. So you got multiple areas in the cerebral cortex involved in sleep, memory, cognition, etc., motor control, language, okay? What you want to remember is that these things are a coordination between the higher brain parts up in the cerebrum, specifically let's actually do cerebral cortex, but also different basal nuclei areas are going to be working with this, okay? And then also you can have integration with the cerebellum and the brainstem as well. So you're not going to have one part of the brain that does one thing, okay? And what's important to remember is that this idea of defined anatomical boundaries between functional areas is a myth, okay? It is very difficult to say that there are truly defined anatomical boundaries. There are certain things like the hypothalamus and the thalamus where we can say there are very specific neurons doing very specific things. But for any of these integrative functions, you don't really have defined anatomical boundaries because there are so many different things working together. Okay? All right, and I know at the very beginning I mentioned that we were going to look at brain waves, but we're not going to look at brain waves. We're going to put that on the next video because I think it fits in a little bit better. But I said it at the very beginning, so I guess I better explain that I'm not actually going to talk about it now that I changed my mind in the 20 minutes I've been talking. All right, I'm going to stop here and you can move on.